I think the way that the problem of complexity has been solved, and this is the best argument I know of for the truth of the Darwinian notion of evolution. Now, I don't think that our models of evolution are complete by any stretch of the imagination. I know they're not, partly because of recent work done on epigenetics, which suggests that you can inherit acquired traits. Right? And when I went to university, when I started going to university in the 1980s, that was heresy, really. Like, no, you cannot inherit acquired traits, but actually you can inherit acquired traits. That's the field of epigenetics studies that. And that's a radical shift in perspective, because we also don't know exactly what that means across any length of time. And when you're thinking about evolutionary lengths of time, you're thinking about 3.5 billion years, because that's the span of time over which life evolved. And so even things that don't have a overwhelmingly marked potency for one generation can be unbelievably powerful across time. And then there's also the issue of sexual selection, because you'll hear Darwinists continually describe the world and the evolutionary world as a place of randomness. And that's not true. And I don't know why they make that statement. The mutations are random or quasi-random, because we don't understand mutations that well yet either. And most mutations are deadly, right? Most mutations are deadly. There's a set of them that are harmful but not deadly. And then there's a tiny, tiny proportion that could, in principle, produce some benefit to the next generation, assuming environmental shift, say, in the direction of the mutation. So, and there's a randomness element to that. We know that. I mean, part of the reason that you mutate, or your cells mutate, your DNA mutates, is because of background levels of radioactivity. And a lot of that's a consequence of solar activity, right? So cosmic rays come zipping through the atmosphere and they nail your DNA and produce minor alterations, and that's a mutation. And if you crank up the background radiation rate, like say around Chernobyl, then the mutation rate rises, and there's definitely a random element to that. And it's necessary for there to be a random element, because as far as I can tell, the only way you can beat a random environment is by producing random changes, right? So, the idea, basically, the environment isn't some static place that's selecting for higher and higher levels of fitness, or it's certainly not doing that in any static way. And so it's shifting around randomly. And then, you have a structure your species has a structure that's a consequence of this immense evolutionary journey, and it's moderating itself randomly within certain parameters, the parameters being that most mutations will kill you, like alterations in your fundamental form generally tend to kill you, so they're incremental. And so the mutations are random, and they match, hopefully, they match the randomness in the environmental shift, and so you can more or less keep up that way. But then there's additional complicating factors, and they're not trivial. And one of them is whatever epigenetics does. We don't know anything about that yet. But the second one is sexual selection. And sexual selection is no joke. It could be the primary thing. It's certainly one of the primary things that's driven human evolution. And I think you can say that you think about the environment again. Well, let's think about the environment. So you have a dominance hierarchy, and that's really an old structure. The dominance hierarchy is 300 million years old, because it emerged pretty much whenever there was a nervous system, emergent nervous system, and whenever animals had to occupy the same territory, they automatically organized themselves into something approximating a dominance hierarchy. So it's a very, 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 very old structure. It's older than trees. It's older than flowers. It's old. And as far as real goes from a Darwinian sense, permanent is real. And so when you can say, well, our arboreal ancestors adapted themselves to trees, and so the tree was around long enough to be a feature of the environment. But the dominance hierarchy has been around a lot longer than trees. And you can think of the dominance hierarchy both as an adaptation to the environment, because you'd kind of think about the dominance hierarchy as a cultural construct. But if a cultural construct lasts long enough, then it becomes part of the environment. And so the dominance hierarchy is part of the environment. And what seems to happen, roughly speaking, and this is an oversimplification, but we'll go with it, is that males have a dominance hierarchy, and there's a relatively small number of males that are relatively successful, and those successful males have preferential access to female reproductive capacity, either because the females actively choose the more dominant males, which is very, very common, or because the more dominant males chase all the less dominant males away, so that even if the females don't exercise choice, which they often do, then the only males left around that can serve as reasonable mating partners are the more powerful ones. And so you think you've got two really radical determiners of evolution as a consequence of that. One is that each, I'm not talking about female dominance hierarchies at the moment, but I can talk about them, but that's why this is an oversimplification. But what happens is that the males obviously are selected for their ability to move up dominance hierarchies. Obviously, because the ones that are at the top of the dominance hierarchy reproduce preferentially. And so that means the male dominance hierarchy becomes a method of selection. But then allied with that is the female proclivity for choice on whatever dimension the dominance hierarchy happens to be arranged. And so then female sexual selection also becomes a radical, non-random
make those top jobs more attractive because they require a certain set of skills that aren't transferable. So, for example, if you're going to occupy a top executive position, you have to be willing to work something in the neighborhood of 80 hours a week. That's all you ever do. That's your life. And that's the price you pay for running something that's incredibly competitive and demanding. And so there's only a small number of people who are willing to do that, and those are generally men. And there's all sorts of other issues that drive men in the workplace to earn more money. So, for example, men work longer hours. And so if you work 44 hours a week, you make twice as much money as someone who works 34 hours a week. So we're going to do the stats to see who works longer hours. We know that male doctors work far longer hours than female doctors, for example. Now, there's reasons for that. The general reason is that women have more duties on the child care front, but no one's figured out how to monetize that. Men are more likely to move to work. Men are more likely to do dangerous jobs. Men are more likely to go into STEM fields, and in executive positions, they're more likely to take positions like sales, where the pay is higher than positions like human resources. To analyze pay by gender is a completely inappropriate statistical analysis.
But you describe all those things. You describe all those things as if they're a given. They just have to be because of differences between men and women. They don't have to be, do they? And that's the point the Prime Minister's making.
No, the point that she's making fundamentally is that there's some evidence that women taken globally earn less than men taken globally if you do the statistics badly, and that indicates that society is unfair. And it's not a reasonable point. You can't make a case that there's a gender gap when you do the statistics badly.
I understand that, but a lot of people listening might be saying, I'm going to say, I experience in my own life, again and again, from being told at school that you're not going to be as good at maths, through to all the things that happen to you during your life. Again and again, as a woman, I'm told, and I live an experience where I have fewer opportunities. And then I look at the gender pay gap, and it does exist on aggregate, and I think, well, that's another thing that holds me down.
Look, if people want to use bad information to generate social policies that are going to be problematic, that's up to them. But it's going to cause a tremendous amount of trouble, because the reality of the situation is that you can't take a complex multifactorial phenomena like wage differential and reduce it to a single variable. No matter